So have you heard of Huntington, West Virginia? Yes, okay. And when you think of Huntington, West Virginia, are there anything that come to mind? Go Herd. All right, I like that one. Family, scenery. Any big things that we might have been in the news about?
Opioid epidemic.
Okay, opioid epidemic, overdose capital. Something else? It's a pretty decent movie about campus, right? Marshall University is unfortunately the home of the largest athlete-related incident in which the entire football team died in a plane crash. And that was out of Huntington Tri-State Airport. That airport still exists today. And unfortunately, the team was flying back into Huntington in bad weather. It's an airport located on the top of a mountain, as much of our life is there. And unfortunately, the plane went down, the entire team crashed. And out of that came a movie. Matthew McConaughey came to Huntington right before I moved there, so that was disappointing. But it is one of the things that when people hear about Huntington, they say, is that plane crash? And I'm like, yep, that's that plane crash. Well, recently we've moved out of, is that plane crash, to, oh, the overdose capital of the world. So I don't think that was an upward trend in knowledgeable word association, but it is something that has moved. And so I'm going to tell you by the end of today, we have a new motto that when someone tells you in the future, have you heard of Huntington, West Virginia? You're going to say yes, but for an entirely different reason. So like I said, we are unfortunately the state hardest hit by the opioid epidemic. And I could spend the next 5 hours talking about why that is, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I would also say that you can see on this heat map that there are regions of the state that were disproportionately affected by the opioid epidemic. And that is basically, if you knew the state, you could draw a line across from Huntington, Charleston, and that is the I-64 corridor. And so we know that there's certain maneuvering around that. And then we have our southern coal fields, and that's basically from Huntington, Charleston, all the way across and drop down. So those are the regions of our state most disproportionately affected. So we are located right there in Huntington, and the piece of that that is not seen on the map, right above Huntington is Ohio, and just to the side of Huntington is Kentucky. So we are the tri-state area. As someone who I did grow up in Northern Virginia, so I am an outsider. I don't sound like West Virginian, and I am definitely deemed an outsider, and that's something I'll mention in a minute. I always called the tri-state area like the DC metro area, and so when I moved there, they said tri-state, and I was like, I think you're confused by that terminology. But I've gotten on board, and it means that the rivers run right along the side of campus, and so I would love to show you the opening scene of We Are Marshall. If you have not seen it, go Google it. It is 47 seconds, and it's this introductory poem that zooms in over Huntington. It says there's a small college on the banks of the Ohio River, and in that college town there is a fountain, and once a year that fountain stops. And that happens still to this day, where we commemorate the loss of that football team. So these are some headlines about Huntington. In the eye of the needle, stark photography show the brutal reality of West Virginia's coal country is in the grips of the nation's worst heroin epidemic. 28 people overdosed on heroin in one day. And that was the introduction of fentanyl into our community. We have a population of 2 million. Out of 150, every 1,000 babies are born addicted. Incorrect terminology, but it does say that there. Police in Huntington claim 90% of their workload involves handling, right, all this stuff. West Virginia, America's drug capital. All alone, tucked between two valleys in West Virginia among the Appalachian Mountains, there used to be a town with beautiful nature, bustling coal mines, and developing cities. It is now infested with drug-addicted zombies. Thank you, national media. We appreciate that. This was about the day of the 26 overdoses. It is 28 overdoses once we got the actual data in. It was 26 people were treated on that day. 2 people were found later. They had overdosed alone, and they had not overdosed within that time frame, but they had used drugs from that quote-unquote bad batch. You can see the lovely headline photo that goes alongside this article surrounding our national information around that day. Here are some photos of what, there was a photojournalist came into town and detailed the greatness of Huntington, West Virginia. We're barely in that one. That's not cropped. That's what they took a photo of. And here we have this photo. So I'm going to draw your attention to those top 3 windows, and in a minute I'll show you why. So when we talk about those imagery and we talk about that national news media and we talk about Huntington, there is something very clearly that we are discussing, and it is a figment of our imagination. It's not something that exists. I can't go get it out of the car and bring it in and introduce it to all of you. It is something that isolates individuals and families. It is something that has the power to encourage people to deny a fatal illness. It causes a loss of human life. It causes ongoing financial and emotional costs in our society, but it is a figment of our imagination. What is that? Stigma, absolutely. So when we talk about this, we need to acknowledge the stigma in the room. It is the elephant in the room at all times. So we have our public stigma. That's our community. We all got together in this room, and we decided certain people were less than us. And as a group, we voted on who those people were. We decided they were folks with mental health disorders, especially those with severe mental health disorders. They were those of us who didn't dress like us, who didn't smell like us, who didn't look like us, and definitely those who use drugs or alcohol in ways that we deem inappropriate. So we have that public stigma, right? It's not nearly as formal. We didn't actually all get together. You didn't miss that convention. But it was a period where we agreed upon this. And we passed that transmission through a lot of ways. There's a whole series of research on how we transmit stigma in our society. One of the most damaging parts of this, though, is self-stigma. When we internalize this, we say, if society thinks that about me, it must be true. Society says, let them die. Okay, I should just die. Society says, you can't recover. I can't recover, so why even bother? So that internalized self-stigma is something that's very damaging. And I've couched that both in substance use while I'm talking, but when we're talking about Appalachia, when we're talking about West Virginia, we are talking about stigma layered upon stigma layered upon stigma. And so those stigmatizing beliefs of Appalachia mean you need to know the culture in the community if you're going to address any type of problem, because there are certain beliefs that are held that layer that stigma on itself. So stigma is actually one of the top barriers to accessing treatment. A figment of our imagination is killing people. Okay? So that is something that is what we are constantly trying to fight against. A figment of our imagination is letting people die. And that is not something that is where we should continue as a society, whether it's mental health or substance use disorders or any other stigmatized person or population. So people will say, well, there's, let's put up those viral videos. Huntington was absolutely the face of a viral national video. I refuse to show it, of two people in the front seat of a car slumped over and a kid buckled in a high chair in the back, or a car seat in the back of the car. And they used that video, police put that video and that photo out, they blasted it into our community and nationally and internationally as well. And people said, well, if people just knew what they looked like, they'd stop. Guys, we fixed it. We can all go home. All we need to do is change all of our Facebook photos to horribly denigrating and damaging photography, and everyone will stop using drugs and alcohol. I've solved it. NIDA can go home. The National Institutes of Health are done. Tell CDC we've got it under control. Right? That seems ludicrous. And no one said, you're right, no one got up and left, because we know that's not going to solve it. And what in fact we know is that it's far worse than that. Those damaging photos cause two things. They cause the general population to hold more stigma, and they cause individuals within that stigmatized group to say two things. One, at least I'm not that bad, or if that's what people think about me, I might as well just die. And so you see an uptick of people overdosing and suicides around that sort of viral imaging. And so it's important that our messaging is actually accurate, and it goes into the communities, and it has the target, right? So I'll ask people, why are you showing that? What's your intent? And if you can't tell me what your intent is, then stop showing it. And either way, stop showing it. And so I have unfortunately presented on this topic moments after the presenter before me used that image. And I was like, this is going to get awkward really quick. But it's important that we confront that within our communities. So I drew your attention to those top 3 photos because I'd like to show you the Marshall University Rec Center. It's a state-of-the-art, gorgeous 4-story facility with a rock climbing wall, a pool, 4 basketball courts, 3 racquetball courts, and those are those top 3 images. I'm not exactly seeing this image in this one, right? It's all about our staging. Like, this is a well-done image. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how they manage to pull this off, and it is through false lighting. So that bright white light doesn't actually exist. There's definitely a spotlight on that building. There are some billboards like this, but that's like the only one really. It's not exactly a common theme in our region. And it doesn't look nearly this dark and dreary. We do have the sun in Appalachia, and Huntington, it does exist there as well. And so I think it's important that when all of our images are black and white, everybody in Huntington or West Virginia appears to be both pregnant and without shoes. It's important that we challenge that narrative overall. And that's a very damaging narrative. A lot of people hold those beliefs and continue to do so, right? I still sometimes stutter on my West Virginia. I live in West Virginia. No, I am loud and proud to be in West Virginia right now. But it's very important that we challenge that belief. All right, so ask yourself, take a moment and just think, you've come to a recovery conference, you want to talk and advocate for this, but just making sure that, are you checking your beliefs about substance use? How do your beliefs impact you? We know that some people might say, well, I can hold some negative beliefs, but when I'm with people, they don't know that, right? I act very positive, I'm very encouraging. I do a lot of work within our healthcare field, and they'll regularly sort of say that, right? Like, I can talk about those people, but when I'm at work, they wouldn't know that. We know that that's inherently impossible, that our personal beliefs actually cause us to act in certain ways external to ourselves. Whether it's you didn't check your face appropriately, it's pretty hard to keep your face in check 24/7, and you'll start to hate your job or what you're doing. Because if you hate the smell of coffee or you hate your job and you work in a coffee shop, slowly but surely you'll start to hate the smell of coffee, and that will trigger negative feelings. If you've ever been an individual who is on call, when you were no longer on call, could you hear that cell phone ringtone without like, okay, no, it's okay, right? I was on call 24/7 for a period of time, and that ringtone still goes off in a room, and I'm like, I have a visceral reaction to that noise, right? And it's not something I can control. I can say, it's okay, you don't do that anymore, you don't have to leave the house, but I still have that reaction, right? Our internal beliefs still impact the way we engage with people. How do our beliefs impact our workplace? How do they impact those we talk to and those around us? How do they impact our friends, patients, clients, those in our community? And what words are we commonly referring to? And I know you guys are going to get a brilliant dose of language tomorrow, but I will never talk about this subject without giving just my quick 2 cents on it, which is making sure that we speak recovery, right? What does that mean? Well, it means that as a society, we need to be pushing for person-first language. Mental health really made this giant push about a decade ago. It's still slow to move, and it's slow to move in certain parts of the country more than others, obviously. And so we want to make sure that we're using language that is respectful to an individual, the person in the community. We want to make sure that we're using language that promotes or offers the opportunity for recovery in the language we're talking about. And so what does that mean? Well, it means there's a lot of words on this slide, but I'm just really going to draw your attention to the top 2. It means that when I'm talking in our community that I will always use person first, an individual not yet in recovery. Isn't that the most hopeful way to refer to a human? Like, you're just not there yet. An individual with a substance use disorder. I work in the hospital setting, and so I need to make sure that if our physicians are using hospital-based language, we need to use hospital-based language all the time for all of our diseases or disorders. And then I mentioned in that headline that was very factually inaccurate about babies born addicted. Babies are not born addicted. That is completely inaccurate. You cannot be addicted because part of addiction is a craving of the object, loss of control over its use, and continued use despite adverse consequences. Infants hold none of the above. Infants are born with exposure. They are born experiencing withdrawal, or they are born with a medical diagnosis of neonatal abstinence syndrome or neonatal opioid withdrawal symptoms, NAS or NOWS. We love our acronyms, right? And so just making sure that we use that language and moving away from certain things about choice, morality, or denigrating terms or language. So what can we do? Well, very briefly, we can all work to change our language. It's not impossible. It is hard. For the first year that we did a huge push on this in meetings and collaborations, it would always be fun. Someone would be like, I was talking to an individual with a substance use. Did I get that right, Lynn? And I'd be like, yes, good job. For a while, right? Everybody would check their language really quick. And it gets like that, right? If you go to college and you start swearing, and then you have to go home at spring break and pretend like you weren't just swearing for the past 4 months, it's pretty hard, right? You're going to stub your toe at some point and let one of those giant words roll off the tongue. So it's not something that you can do in some settings and not others. And so we really advocate that professionals especially utilize that language. And I know Tom talked about this yesterday. Making sure that on social media we share and like positive stories, right? Utilize positive campaigns around this. And one of the biggest reasons I always say this is I was doing a training in a middle school near us, and I used to do SBIRT all the time, every day. And I was our SBIRT coordinator for Marshall, and we trained 5,000 people in 3 years. And that was a great opportunity, but I did say if I said the SBIRT or word SBIRT one more time, I was going to cut out my own tongue. But what I was doing a training, and we couched ours a lot. We did about an hour on stigma and language before we started the training. And after that first hour, I had a middle school teacher come up to me, and she said, "Can we go in the hallway?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to get in trouble." So we went out into the hallway, and she just said, she burst into tears. And I was like, "Are you okay? What's going on?" And I had many people disclose substance use, ask for help or assistance. But she said, "My sister is currently in active addiction, and nobody here knows that. And I have worked here for 12 years, and I met you like 3 seconds ago and learned who you were about an hour ago, and I'm telling you because nobody here would understand." And they talk about those junkies in the break room, and then they ask me, "How's your family?" I'm never going to be able to disclose or open up to them. And so those people might not have thought that there was any harm, no foul. Everybody here thinks like me. But they had no idea within their midst was someone drastically struggling with a family member and seeking support that she was not going to be able to get in that workplace. So there's a few major ways that we can address stigma, and I'm not going to talk too much about these, but I just want to make sure we know. So the research indicates one way is to protest, right? We stand up against it and we say, that's not right. And what you're doing isn't accurate. And sometimes we could shame those people. We could sort of reverse it a little bit. But we know the research indicates this isn't necessarily effective in the long term. It might cause some short-term change. But it does feel really good, so I'm absolutely a troll on Twitter for our local news media, and every time they're like, "Addicted babies," I'm like, "The price of an individual with this substance," like I rewrite all their headlines for them and tweet them back. So although it's not factually going to make a meta change, it is really enjoyable. And so I do encourage you to do that, and we have changed our Herald Dispatch. They recently wrote an article about this, and we're like, "Addicts giving back to the community." And I was like, "No, fix it." And they pulled their online version down and changed it and re-put it up. And so we've been able to make some of those small changes, and I'll count that as my win for the day sometimes. So we can also do education. And this is hard, and it takes time, and it takes investment, but it does make a difference, right? It's one component, though. It's not the only thing that's going to cause lasting change. And what we want to do is present factual information. We want to actually challenge myths, right? So sometimes when people say, "Well, if we give out clean syringes, people are going to start using heroin." And I'm like, "I have a clean syringe for you. Would you like to start using heroin?" And they're like, No, I wouldn't do that, but other people would." And I'm like, "Well, who are those other people? Do you know them? Are they your friends? Let's go find them. Let's see how this works," right? That belief that this actual process, like anyone is just going to walk into harm reduction and be like, "Well, I'd like to start using heroin, so do you have any clean needles?" Right? That belief not taken to the end result promotes stigma. And so we can challenge that in certain circumstances. And it needs to be done from a place of compassion and understanding about that population. It has a small but persistent effect. And so once you are able to start doing this, you're kind of starting to drop pebbles in the pond. And if you can get those key stakeholders, you can drop the boulder in the pond to make that lasting change. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that I know all of you have the AP style guide on like the top of your Amazon wish list. And every time it gets updated, you just like order the new copy, right? No, just me? Okay. So the AP style guide, you would probably buy it for freshman English or like sometime. And it's where you learn to cite and why you should cite people and what references are and why you use certain grammar and all that jazz. Well, they actually changed the AP style guide to include avoiding stigmatizing language. And so now it is incorrect for people to not use person-first language. And so the AP style guide changed it, and they do a good job of trolling people on Twitter as well sometimes. If you tag them, sometimes they'll be like, "That's right." And I'm like, "Yeah, the AP style guide tweeted me back. I am definitely a nerd." But they do this style chat, and then they work with Recovery Answers on this. And so that's just one way of showing, like, it's not just me saying it, like, the AP style guide backs me up. But so does NIDA and SAMHSA and those bigger organizations. You can also promote, we have run a national campaign in West Virginia, Stigma Free, WV, has a nice little ring to it. And so they have a website that helps promote videos and news and campaigns and articles and resources about being stigma-free in the state of West Virginia. And the other major way to address stigma in a population is contact, right? To engage someone with that stigmatized population, right? To sort of use that, and regularly, we'll be in engagement with someone and someone will say, well, I'm one of those people. And everyone's like, oh, I feel awkward now. What did I say for the past 10 minutes, right? To show that, they walk amongst us. That idea that it's not us versus them, there's not this group somewhere in a community or a house that we sort of spy on, but rather, that zombie conception, but rather it's part of it. And this has been a huge push within our region. And so we have a state campaign and then a local campaign, so #MyHuntington. And so you can see that there's a lot of different initiatives as part of this. The Council of Churches have worked on these posters that they put up that capitalize on a person and then tell their story. There is a garden, there's yoga, recovery yoga, and all these types of different ways that people are engaging and talking about this topic a little differently. Our abstinence-based recovery peer center, Recovery Point, released videos for a while every Friday on Recovery is Real, and they profiled a different person in recovery each week. We did a series sort of like the vagina monologues, but Appalachian Addiction, Our Stories. So 10 different people stood up, shared a story, a first-person narrative, either about themselves or a loved one, either as a family member, a sibling, an individual, or a child related to substance use. We had a group of teenagers work on a campaign called the City of Hope, and they released stories and profiles on Instagram and Facebook on a different person in regards to substance use each week, and share that person's personal narrative as another way of just challenging and humanizing all of this. And Ashley is my wonderful peer coach, so plug to her. So those are some of the areas. And of course, if you've seen it, you know that we have 3 heroines who walk in Huntington, and that was our national documentary. And that is actually them over at the Oscars for the heroin documentary. And so our fire chief, Jan Rader, and one of our offices, our judge that used to work with drug court, that should be called recovery court, but that's a different issue. And then someone who works in sort of street ministry. All right, so now you've addressed stigma. We can all go home, right? If we all just use proper language and we had appropriate person-first terminology, we'd solve the problem. We know that that's not true, right? We know that just by addressing it, you actually then have to have the treatment infrastructure. And so that is something that we've worked really hard on. So we looked at the continuum care about 3-4 years ago in Huntington and said, what are we lacking? And it was like, oh, all of it, right? That might be the problem. Herein lies the issue, right? We had 12 steps and mutual aid groups. We had some family-based, the loved ones group existed. There was GRASP, Grief Recovery After a Substance Passing groups. There was a long-term mental health agency that was running some medication-assisted treatment, some detox, some other types of programs, but this sort of continuum, right, this ability to enter and engage along the spectrum of care was severely lacking. And so the first thing we said was we need to know our community, right? I am an outsider. I will always be an outsider. I could live in Huntington till the day I die. I will be an outsider. Only if I have a child born in the state of West Virginia would they then be considered a almost insider. It is a very tight-knit, exclusive community. When you talk to people, they're like, my family's lived here forever. And so there's families of Wayne County. My best friends are one of them. They have a book. They meet on the top of a mountain once a year, right? They make all the casseroles. So there's certain things about that. But when we look at Appalachia, there are very key factors that if you don't account for, you can't change or address the community. And in fact, you're stigmatizing the population even more. And so it's really important that any work within our community or in this region targets these values and understands them. And so there was a book put out about the Appalachian region called Hillbilly Elegy. And if that's your view of Huntington or Appalachia as a whole, I'm sorry. Go read the critiques. There's a lot of them. And they're accurate. That is not my favorite book. There at least has been a few, The Appalachia Reckoning, The Response, to that book is quite good. And there are quite a few others that sort of call to attention the stigmatizing beliefs around this. And so what we want to make sure is that we understand this egalitarianism. There is an underlying religious worldview. You know, it's just something people do, even if it's not necessarily the strongest value in their life. You know, it is just culture, religion is part of that. The love of the land, right? This sort of belief that this is where I'm from, and no matter what, this is where I'll stay. And unfortunately, with the transmission of time, that has changed, which has caused some of this exodus from the state, because there is this ingrained belief, and this is the holler that I'm from, and this is where my family grew up, but kids don't have that same investment in that area, and so they're leaving. And also an avoidance of conflict, the lack of ability maybe to call something out or acknowledge it, but rather to take it internal. Like families deal with things in close-knit ways. And so we need to acknowledge all of that when we go to build any type of continuum. So when we go to identify key partners, by the way, that would be a much more accurate view of Huntington right there in the beautiful fall, and actually showing that the town exists and not just entirely black forests. There is not a black forest anywhere near Huntington, so again, that initial image was quite well constructed. So we look to identify key partners, right? And because I just said religious worldview, if I don't acknowledge our faith community, I might as well not even start, right? If we cannot get recovery preached on Sunday mornings, we are really lacking. If we're not educating our faith leaders and making them part of that continuum, we will struggle and suffer. So it's important to engage that. We need to be engaging our business community. Our Chamber of Commerce and our Chamber President is someone that I interact with regularly. Service groups, big brothers, big sisters, right? Those succeed in some ways, but struggle in other ways. Why? Because they're turning outside the family for that leadership position. And so identifying how to build that in. Social services, our housing commission, our elected officials, right? That is something that Huntington luckily has had. We have a very strong mayor who is very open to being educated around substance use disorder, uses person-first language, really advocates for this and helps determine the narrative in our community. Our education systems, our child care and developmental services, especially when we're talking about neonatal abstinence syndrome, that we need to know what kids are experiencing and how child care needs to adapt appropriately. And then our media, right? So after those series of reports, we actually put a moratorium. No elected officials in Huntington talk to the national media anymore. We would not take interviews. The hospitals and the major institutions just said no. If you're going to come in and we're going to tell you what's going on and what's going well, and then you're just going to post a black and white photo with a bunch of needles on the ground, we're not talking to you, right? It's not effective for you to come in and keep using this community, right? And so we did that. There was a full-blown moratorium on the press, and so those all got shut down. And then we started working with our local press more, right? How to share the stories, how to share the positive narratives, and then going off that, going on to social media, using My Huntington to advocate for things. And then really making sure we have our healthcare system and our universities actively engaged. And Huntington is very lucky to have Marshall University. And Marshall Health is the practice arm of the Joan C. Edwards School of Medicine. And then we have a pharmacy school, a physical therapy school. And so those programs all actively engage together around this. And so what does that mean to actively engage? Well, it means that we've built community collaboration. And that community collaboration has a lot of different visions and views. It's small and big, and I'll talk you through some of those collaboratives. But when we go to build a community collaborative, what's the most important thing? Well, it's not about you. So we need to take the I out of the sentence. We very much try and advocate for the royal we, right? So when we discuss we, do a lot of things in Huntington. And that means that no one person, no one entity, no one intervention changed the course of Huntington. But our overdose rates are down 40%. 40% right now. In 3 months of the last quarter of 2018, our overdose rates dropped 40%. And so something is working, and we are working very hard at that. And so that means we need to identify each community's strengths. There's certain things that people bring to the table, even if it's not always apparent at first, right? We've all maybe engaged with a community partner or an individual that's a little bit more challenging than others, right? That's not just in any single community, that you don't run up against political backlash or personal beliefs or this is the way we've always done it here, #Appalachia. And so that sort of belief is challenging, but what are the strengths that bring to the table? Well, one is sometimes we challenge that. If you've always done it here, it ain't working, right? So let's try something else, okay? Let's move on to another path. But how slowly can we move that needle? And sometimes that's what we do. Who else needs to be here, right? Like we looked at a table once and we were like, we don't have the business community. Like this isn't gonna work. Like if you can't get people back to work, great, you got them into recovery and what do they just sit there? Like it's not an active state of being. There needs to be employment, re-engagement in the community. So the business community is key. Other times we've been somewhere and it's, there's this woman who's been doing dinners on Friday night down at her house for the past 20 years. Why isn't she here? Do you have an email address for her? Right? Like, no, you're going to have to go to her house. Okay. But making sure you have key stakeholders in each community and using other stakeholders to build that stakeholder list. A lot of what we do is, who else should be here? I'm having a meeting. I'll send the meeting to a group of people. I'm just asking you all to identify who else should be here, and sort of spreading that out like that twofold effect of getting to know and engage. We do try and be really transparent or honest. We work on a lot of grants. The Department of Addiction Sciences, which sits in family medicine, they just went through an internal review at Marshall Health, and the JCO and all those other standings came through. And my chair got pulled in and they said, there's 50 or 45 external grants in family medicine. You shouldn't be counting each student's fellowship or scholarship. This is wrong. Please get the full list and get back to us. And so we got the full list and we were like, we're really sorry, you're absolutely right, it was wrong, it was 50, not 45. And they said, what? In 2 years, we've expanded that level of grants astronomically from, I think, about 3 to that number of external grants. And a lot of that relates back to addiction. And when there's money involved, everybody wants to be involved. And especially in a community that's done it by bootstraps and shoestring budgets and every other little colloquialism you've ever had. So it's important to be aware of that and be honest and upfront about how we're going to divvy this up and what it looks like. And that means that when we're working on grants, we are sending those out on emails. We're saying to a coalition, we're going to go for this grant. If somebody else in the room wants to go for this, let's work together on it rather than competing against each other. That just looks stupid when you go to a federal fund and they say, there's 2 from the same small community, right? But that sometimes means hard conversations need to happen. This is the way that we need to move forward. This fits into the larger plan. Although that's great, it cannot be the key focus. And being open and honest, but then also part of the culture is coming back around, right? Like, we work here. Next time when I see this grant initiative come up, I'm going to propose that this way over here. So making sure we do that and consistently expanding our reach. Huntington and Cabell County have worked very hard on this, but when I said that map off the start, that 64 corridor to the southern coal fields, now that's our major push, right? This past week, we received funding to work with another county that's virtually, we're a pass-through. They just, would not necessarily be able to set up that structure in the time, and so it's going to pass right through us. We're going to assist with grant management, and we're going to help them build that infrastructure through peer-on-peer and one-on-one mentoring so that they can recreate that in our community. It means a lot more work, but that's the only way that we're going to succeed is roll out what's working and continue to replicate that model. So here are a few collaborations that helped really push this. And we have had the what was called the Cabell County Substance Abuse Prevention Partnership for a long time. That came about 12 years ago and was a grassroots campaign. There were unfortunately some high school students were shot on prom night. It continues to be an unsolved murder in Huntington, but it was drug-related. And people said, drugs in Huntington? And were shocked. And literally, like a group of concerned people came together and created this coalition. And over time, it's grown. It's now a DFC-funded coalition and SAPT funding, so that prevention. And it's recently been rebranded into the Prevention Empowerment Partnership. A little easier to say, PEP. Versus CSAP, and also we're not just in Cabell County anymore. And that brings together 12 sectors in the community. So those initial community members I mentioned off the bat all have to be represented in those meetings. And that means that we have the chief of police or his representative, the mayor or his representative, actively engaged in those conversations quarterly. ESPERT was a big trigger on our campus. So The way that SBIRT came in, the wellness coordinator developed or worked with a team to write that grant, and they gave co-PI status to all of the faculty member who were on the grant, which broke down silos very effectively, right? Everybody now had to be actively engaged as a council of directors. So that was counseling, social work, psychology, nursing, the pharmacy school, the physical therapy school, the med school, and public health. Then sports medicine, communication disorders, lots of others got engaged. But that really helped start building collaboration and communication. And so that grant was great for what it did in regards to SBIRT, screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. But what it was brilliant for was promoting collaboration. And so sometimes those partnerships can have that secondary effect that you might not think or know about. We developed something called Faith Community United, and this was to engage faith leaders. And what we did was we brought them all together, we gave them a survey, and we did focus groups and said, what do you need to know? When do you need to know it? And for how long should those meetings be? Everything was decided by the group. So they chose Tuesday mornings for 2 hours from 10 to noon as their most chosen meeting time. And then we identified all of the topics they were interested in and developed a 6-part training series. And I'll show you those 6 parts in a moment. But that brought together the City of Huntington, Marshall Health, First Steps Recovery and Wellness, a day drop-in program. And all of us worked together to develop that collaboration with them. And I'll tell you what that training did. And then our Healthy Connections Coalition is more than 20 different community members and actual organizations come together. They just finished their meeting, so I missed it today, of that collaboration to engage around pregnant and postpartum women and how to track from birth to engagement in school, because we lose a lot of kids when they have a baby and then they show up in kindergarten. Like, what happened in between? Anyone know? Nope, no one has a clue. So that was to develop that need or that gap in the issue. So CSAP, it focuses, or PEP, it was CSAP for forever. PEP focuses on in-school education, so evidence-based in-school education at each grade level, and was one of the helps to initiate that the state needed to have comprehensive drug education in every level. That does not mean the same 20 minutes of don't do drugs, drugs are bad, at every age group. That means evidence-based policies that change and grow with children. They also shouldn't just be drug or alcohol free. They should be resiliency life skills programs, right? There is a big difference between just anti-drug and what am I meant to be for, right? Wouldn't it be much better if we were pro something than just anti this? And so making sure those narratives are had and are in the school board. So really promoting protective factors and engaging in that active engagement with both the teenagers who are part of the coalition and have their own coalition, but then also that they're engaging with the larger community doing drug take-back days and knowing a little bit more so they become peer-on-peer advocates. SBIRT, like I mentioned, that SAMHSA gold standard of screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment, that shared PI, and this really promoted collaboration. This was something that engaged much more broadly. So Faith Community United, what we did, I said, we brought together this group of leaders. This, you can sort of see it in the background, that's some of our faith leaders at a training. And what we did was first bring them together, do the focus and the surveys. We then told them the results, so you guys chose it, right, which is a key piece of Appalachia. Like, me and my university didn't come in and say, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. We said, what do you need from me and how can I help? And so out of that grew the series of sessions, and we did it to focus first on understanding the epidemic. We did like Addiction 101. Like, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. And when you take a drug, dopamine gets flooded. Like that basic. And stigma, language. This is a little bit about it. This is how your genes affect it. This is how the environment affected. This is what ACEs are, right? Like people, once they hear about ACEs, everyone went out and heard the TED Talk and got the book and really engaged on that much more eloquently. And the key piece is that we have a faith leader as part of our leadership team. And so she could easily open or close sessions with, from my perspective, this is what we need to be aware of, and really that small group engagement. Then we did SBIRT. We did motivational interviewing, like how to have a brief engagement with an individual. What is an evidence-based practice? And when you don't know what to say, here's what to say or do. And so tangible skills. A lot of people were sick and tired of talking about the problem, and they were like, now what? What can I do to do something about it? And so this was an evidence-based piece. We talked about the idea of enabling, and when you do this, what you're actually doing and how to actually help. Then humanizing. We brought in a whole group of individuals in long-term recovery to share their stories one-on-one. One as a faith leader, an individual who had lost a child to substance use, another one whose son is currently incarcerated due to substance use, a faith leader who had recently is one of the faith leaders who's often called to perform funerals in Huntington when no one else is either A, willing or able. And so those folks shared their stories, and then individuals who had chosen different pathways to recovery. So humanizing it, right? That context. So we've done education, we've done a little bit of protest with them, and now we're humanizing and giving that contextual engagement for them. There is a craft training, and so they brought that in collaboration with Marshall for how to engage the family, what do family support groups look like, how to help a family talk to a loved one about substance use disorder. Again, tangible skills. And then we brought in what we considered sort of highly stigmatized programs or things that people didn't know about and had very small beliefs about. So harm reduction. The head of the harm reduction came in and talked to faith leaders about what that actually was. Someone who works for our quick response team, same thing, came in and talked about what that was. And then we did a resource fair. We brought in all the different resources and locked them all in a room and made them play nice, right? We had everybody able to go out and engage and meet and put a face so that when they were doing a warm handoff, they actually knew who the person in their community was. So again, getting people out of their churches and into the community and getting the community into the churches. And so balancing that. We did it over one training once a month for 6 months. We did that one time during the day, then we did it again at night, and then we did it all on a Friday. So we tried to hit everybody in every which way they could possibly want that training to, again, address those barriers and meet those needs. And then our coalition. So Healthy Connections, what that means is that it's a collaborative group of individuals who have come together to address one of the largest incidences of neonatal abstinence syndrome. And unfortunately, Cabell County is the highest rate of NAS in the country. One is because we have a hospital that acknowledges it and treats it and has a neonatal treatment unit, the NTU. So people come from all over. At any given time, our census is only 50% Cabell County. So it's not just that Cabell County somehow has this high rate of pregnancy. There's not something in the water, but rather that it's people come because there's treatment there. So what we do is we work with 2 evidence-based treatment programs in the hospital, a MARC program, Maternal Addiction Recovery, that identifies women when they're pregnant, and then the MOMS program, Maternal Opioid Maintenance and and they work once the baby is born. See, the acronyms even get me. And they work once the baby is born and they're in the NTU to provide groups and support around visitation in the hospital, right? Because it's well and good to have visitation or groups, but if there while visitation's happening, CPS is going to ding you for not being with your baby, and your provider is going to ding you for not being in group. And so we've set up an unobtainable barrier. And so this is something we work with them to provide what's called a family navigator. And the family navigator comes alongside that woman and says, you're not alone in this. You are carrying a boulder, and we're going to carry it together for a little while. I'm not going to take it from you, but I'm going to help you carry it while we try and figure out this process. Because what often happens is someone has a baby, and then we give them like 20 pamphlets. Good luck. Right? If you don't have a substance use disorder, that's overwhelming, let alone if you do. And now let's layer Appalachia that says individualism is important and keeping it within the family. So Birth to 3 shows up. They say, we're here to help you and your kid. Anything we can do? Nope, we're good here. All the time. Like referrals to Birth to 3 fall because everyone doesn't want to disclose. But the family navigator comes alongside and says, oh, this is what these people do. This is what would help you. And let's be honest in the appropriate way with them to set up these services, right? So we've created an ally and a peer with that individual. And then they also get paired with a peer coach who is specifically a woman who had a baby, most often with neonatal abstinence syndrome or some level of exposure. So she can actually stand there and say, my baby was in the NTU too. I know what this is like. So really trying to decrease that stigma and promote that resiliency. And there's a ton of factors that we then try and engage with, like a mom support group that really just targets those because of that stigma sometimes within 12 steps or mutual support groups as well, connecting the family members, and then tracking those kids so that we're getting actually some research and data on neonatal abstinence syndrome and how it changes over time. So those are our coalitions, or a small sample of our coalitions, and I wanted to also just target and focus on treatment. So what are some of our collaborative treatments? Well, these are 4. We actually have a ton, but one that really highlights is our Cabell-Huntington Harm Reduction Program. So that is out of our health department, and it is one piece of it. We have a quick response team, and I'll explain what they do. We have Proact, which is an acronym, and I'll explain what they do, and then Project Hope for Women and Children. And these are just some of the collaborating agencies that help support and substantiate all of these programs. So first, harm reduction. We have the Cabell-Huntington Health Department, and they do a syringe exchange program. And they run it predominantly on one day. However, it's now sort of occurs each day as an individual might need. We have our pharmacy students who are as part of that program, and so they're providing Narcan training and Narcan education, so that we have one thing that is one of those factors to decreasing those overdoses and overdose deaths is everybody carries Narcan. Like if I'm in a meeting in Huntington, I'm like, who all has Narcan? I do. It's over there. But most people will be like, I do. Even our mayor carries Narcan. Our communications director for this, like everybody's carrying it, because you never know when you're going to need to be in that situation. And again, then it destigmatizes asking for Narcan. And we've received some great grants and other foundational and private donations to really flood the market with that. We have our social work students who are there to engage and provide mental health and case management services. We have a bulldog of a peer coach, and you have to go through him to really engage in the program, and he has had unbelievable success translating people into recovery from this. And what the success of harm reduction is, and I again could talk on this for hours, but it pulls people out of the shadows, right? If you are using drugs and you're using drugs intravenously, you're not actively saying, oh, it's my primary care visit, I should go make that appointment, right? Like, I don't often make that, except they threaten me that my insurance will go up by some astronomical amount. So I then walk next door, because I work in family medicine, and I'm like, can we do that physical? But if you're using, that's not necessarily going to be that priority. And so it draws someone out of the shadows. They're engaging with a health professional. They are walking into a building in the light of day to engage and be honest and open with someone. And they build these unbelievable relationships in that program that meet the person where they're at. Just some general statistics. At the end of last year, there had been 1,900 people served. We'd had 7,836 encounters, pretty split on gender, homelessness and uninsured, again, consisting of a good majority of those people. Our naloxone distribution just through the harm reduction program of 8,000 naloxone, so that police and fire and first responders are carrying that. And 1,300 overdose reversals reported. So that's the number of people who come back and say, I need another Narcan because I used it and reversed an overdose. So that's not the number of people who are reversing overdoses, right? That's, a lot of people reverse an overdose and never report it. And so being open with that is really wonderful and something great to see. So a quick response team. Well, the quick response team is really cool. It is a group of individuals who go out within 24 to 72 hours of an overdose. So they engage with the individual, and they consist of the team goes to that location of the overdose and or the address. We did a lot of education with our first responders on not just pulling out the wallet, getting the ID, and getting the address that says Topeka, Kansas, because we're not going to Topeka, Kansas. So where does that person currently reside? And so take a second, get the actual address. It's going to help everybody involved. So some of that basic education really did benefit our statistics overall. And so they go out and they target the individual in seeking to reduce and engage in treatment. And so this is what the team consists of. It's a mental health professional and or a peer coach. So some of our mental health professionals started as a peer coach and or are working on becoming mental health professionals. So they're the similar consistency from one of our big mental health or MAC or abstinence-based programs. So all pathways to recovery are encouraged. An EMT is full-time, and so that's who is the team leader. A member of law enforcement in entirely plain clothes. We always say that day one they showed up in full police uniform, their standard uniform, and we were like, no, try again. Came back with half the police uniform. We were like, try again. And so really plainclothes officers to not promote stigma, but also to cause this weird effect. They go back to the department and they say like, hey, guess what? So-and-so, who we've arrested like 17 times, just went in treatment. Isn't that cool? And so these positive stories are coming back, so this two-way flood of information is occurring out of the QRT, which is exciting. And then a faith community leader. So out of Faith Community United, they said, okay, well, now what do we do? And we had just been like, well, you go to your congregations and keep doing good. And they were like, no, I want to do something with this new knowledge. So we wrote them in to the QRT. And so now we have a faith leader who goes out. They don't go out and pray. They don't bring a Bible. They're obviously, again, in plain clothes. And they are just there to support the team and the person if they ask for it, right? They might be able to build that relationship in a different way. So again, meeting the person where they're at and trying to engage overall. This is some preliminary data, and I know it's pretty shoddy on the visual, but we have seen this success over time of the number of referrals, finding that population, and then engaging them in treatment. And so our constant effort is to engage someone and keep them in treatment and doing that tracking and follow-up, and also then going back out after they've engaged and someone's maybe said no, and we've re-engaged them later. We did have a fun success, or a good success. One of our favorite stories, we had we went to a house that the team was engaging with an individual, and they said, we're ready to take you to treatment, and they said, okay. And the guy who was there said, wait, you're taking him to treatment? Can I go too? We were like, sure, done. Duplicated the services, they both went. The other individual had not been part of the overdose list, but that's something we're finding more and more. And the QRT is becoming really an active resource for the larger community. They get a lot more just phone referrals or walk-ins almost to engage with them. So then another collaborative treatment was, well, we realized we have the QRT, and that's well and good. But what about actually providing treatment, right? Like, I'm engaging you in services, or I'm engaging you, but where do you go then? Well, we developed Proact, and that's a one-stop shop. It means you can walk in, receive an intake, and be initiated into services that day, and all pathways to recovery are accepted. So triage, medication-assisted treatment is offered through our FQHC on-site, individual, group therapy, social services, case management, spiritual care on-site, peer recovery services, work site management, job placement, job education, job training, and referral services to other agencies. So you're not just stuck in Proact, you can be referred out to other agencies or services. And that is a collaboration between all of our hospitals in our region and then mental health care providers as well. And it just engages that individual. We took over an old CVS building, so the irony was not lost on that renovation. And it is a beautiful facility that now houses that program. And then our most new endeavor is Project Hope for Women and Children. And this is my personal favorite because we wrote this grant 2 years ago. I'm a family therapist by degree. I'm a marriage and family therapist in LMFT. And I consistently am like, where's the family? Like, where's the system here? That's great that we have so-and-so, but like spouse, kids, like they're not affected, right? Just the individual. No? Okay. So where the heck's the family? And regularly they'd be like, well, that woman should just get into treatment. And I'd be like, and give up those 3 children? I know that's what she should do, but do you realize what you're asking? And so Project Hope opened in December. And it is an 18-apartment center that allows women to bring their children. All pathways to recovery are accepted. And it's about 6 months, intended for about 6 months of residency. Each apartment is fully furnished and looks something a little bit like that. It's not the greatest photo, but I pulled it off our open house day. And so each apartment is fully furnished, 2 or 3 bedrooms, and mom can bring up to 4 children under the age of 12. And so she can be pregnant or have an infant and a kid up to the age of 12 for any type of substance use. It is a smoke-free program. And before I get burned on that one, the SAMHSA has really moved towards the idea that if you stop smoking as well as stopping other drugs simultaneously, your long-term recovery effects a year out are much higher. And so we're working towards that. Now that means there's complete comprehensive tobacco cessation as part of it. So. And lastly, this is our sort of roadmap to recovery. And I highlighted just a few of these, but this is sort of what we saw as our comprehensive version of Huntington and shutting the gaps in our continuum. And so that always makes me say, you know, what does recovery look like in Huntington? Well, looks like our quick response team. It looks like the university. It looks like Doggy Days down in the downtown. Our My Huntington campaigns, Recovery Point, me. Our spring break cleanup. Love when someone pulls photos for me. Luncheons and fashion shows for Recovery Point, Her Place. Downtown music festivals, Proact, Project Hope, and My Huntington means a lot to me. It means the place of recovery, and it means the place that we get to talk and advocate about every day. So when someone says to you in the future, what is My Huntington or what is Huntington, West Virginia, I hope you say it is the city of solutions. It is the epicenter of solutions moving forward, because that is what we want to be known as, and that is what we are fighting every day to become, and not only in Huntington, but West Virginia, and then nationally. And so we want to make sure that each of us have a role, that we are stronger together, and that we are going to adapt, implement, and then identify those different programs. And so if anybody wants to come visit us in Huntington, you are more than welcome. We do a full song and dance routine for all of our outside guests, and you can come tour and see our programs, or you can just come and enjoy the beautiful weather, the outdoor spaces, and we've become a little bit of a foodie town. So if you like some good food, Huntington has that, not just Appalachia. Not everything is casserole. I do promise that. So that is my contact information. You're free to contact me. So thank you.